Time doesn't erase murder. It just hides it better. They said the case was closed. They said no one was watching. But someone always is. Enter the shadows, where every whisper is a clue, and the line between justice and obsession disappears. This is Santana True Crime.
Welcome to Santana True Crime. Tonight we are going to be talking about everyone's favorite book, A Murder on Campus, The Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's most notorious cold case. The author is Brian Santana and Cameron Santana, myself. We've got another special guest with us today to talk about it, all the way from down under. We've got Mainly Murder with Meg and Mom. And of course, we wanted to also welcome Brian Santana. He's, of course, joining us, and you can support him at briansantanaauthor.com. Brian, Meg, and Mom, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for doing this collaboration with me.
Yeah, no problem. It's good. Yeah, it's good to obviously get a cross audience of Australia and the US. So obviously I'm Meg, that's Mum. And yeah, we have a true crime podcast. We're a little bit
new to it all.
Very new to it. It's very opinionated, I guess. Mainly her.
Well, let's start off there. What did you think about the book?
It was great. It's just as I keep saying, like it baffles me how it's still unsolved, and not widely reported on. How it's just, as I said, when you Google it, you guys come up as the main pushing force of this case and getting it out there.
You know what? And that's something that drew me to the case as well. And I'm sure you've got some questions about that. So I don't want to steal your thunder on that. But when I looked into this case, I saw the same thing. I saw a few articles from a student newspaper and some older newspaper clippings, and that was it. And we had tons of questions, which is, part of the reason why we decided to write this book.
Yeah. So what, well, obviously I'm Brian. I'm guessing you started this whole book. So what drew you to writing the book, like this case in particular?
So I first learned about this case in 1999 while I was a student at UNC Asheville. So this is the same school where Virginia Olsen was murdered in 1973. And I learned about this case on the very first day that I was a freshman. Cameron's laughing because he's heard this story before. But no, on my first day, this case was one that I really think about is tied to just my college experience, because the first class I ever went to at UNC Asheville, I was waiting in the lobby before class, and I found myself just looking around the lobby while I was waiting to be let in. And there was this large portrait. It's the one on the cover of our book, which Cameron put up at the beginning. I think he's putting it up right now. There we go. So it didn't have all the blue stuff on there, but it was it was a black and white portrait that was that's Virginia Olsen, and she was holding a paintbrush, painting some scenery. And in real life, it's over 5 feet tall. It's life size portrait that was hanging in the theater. And another student came up to me from the class that had just gotten out. And the student said, that's Virginia Olsen, and she died here a long time ago. It was a really sad story. And that was about it. And later in the semester, another student came up to me when I was waiting for class near the portrait again and said, that's Virginia Olsen, and she was murdered in the theater many years ago. And in fact, our drama department chair actually had to, when this student had first arrived, he said that the drama department chair, when he first started the program, was the one who actually had to call the parents and inform them. And then much later, I discovered that she wasn't killed in the theater at all. She was actually killed in the botanical gardens, and she was raped and murdered, which is even worse. And then but there was she was always this kind of presence, like a ghost story on campus. No one really seemed to know much about her. They didn't really know anything about what had happened. And I was told the case was like unsolved. And so I was kind of living away from home for the very first time. And for me, this case made a deep impression because I had lots of different things I was trying to figure out in my life at the time. 18-year-old living away from home, figuring out what I want to do with the rest of my life, what I was going to study, all of that kind of questions that freshmen are asking, my own students are asking right now as they're starting classes. And I never really imagined that I wouldn't have the opportunity to kind of grow up. So right when I'm starting this big journey, the very first thing I encounter is someone who felt very similar to me, but just who wasn't able to grow up and never left the school. And so, yeah, it made a deep impression. So over the years, I went on to study different things, but I would periodically check back in to see if there were any updates or what had happened. And and it was just one of those that eventually I was teaching a true crime class at the university, and students would ask me about cases that I cared about because I'd written articles, but I hadn't written anything long form at that point in true crime. I was like a 19th century American specialist by training. And this was a case I really cared about. This was one I wanted to know more about, and I was genuinely curious about. And that's kind of where all of this started, and it intersected with just things happening in Cameron's life. And that was where kind of the project kind of started.
Wow. So how did Cameron get roped into writing for this book?
Really good question. And I think roped in would be a very good way to put it, in a good way. So I was a Raleigh police officer for 16 and a half years prior to this project. And at the time, we had a lot of things going on. There were riots all over the place. There was COVID happening. And my schedule was just all over the place. And on top of that, I had a child with special needs. We ended up spending 98 days in the NICU.
Wow.
When we came out of the NICU, my daughter had a trach and a feeding tube. And so it took a lot of effort at home as well. So I found myself, basically, I would sleep a couple hours a night at best and just take some naps throughout. And it got to a point where my wife and I decided that something is just going to have to give. And obviously for us, it was me giving up the job that is just all over the place and focusing on my family life. And so I did that, and I found a small department outside of Raleigh called Rollsville. And it was one of those towns that there's no crime, and everyone just buys you, coffee, and, the old men at the restaurant, are just like fighting over your bill. I mean, that's all there was to do. And the chief just let me work whenever I wanted. It was a really good situation. And that was going really well, but I didn't have the excitement of actually chasing bad guys and doing real police work. And Brian at the time was teaching a true crime class, and we would talk about some of the cases that his students were researching, because they were actually pulling court records and police reports and doing a really good job. And I found myself actually getting really interested in that, which I know sounds like that would be common sense, like, a police officer would want to research police things. But really, when you're a cop, you don't watch cop shows. You usually watch sports and sports. You don't watch
variety
or or any of that stuff, right? It's like sports, some comedies, and like cheap horror movies. But I really found myself getting involved in this, and I found myself actually researching the case myself. And then one day Brian came to me and he said, I've got this case about Virginia Olsen. She was killed on UNC Asheville's campus. Not a lot has been written about it. I would like to write something on it. Maybe it'll be an article. And if we get enough, maybe it'll be a book. And I was just very nonchalant, like, yeah, sure. I didn't think this was actually going to turn into anything. And then the next day, he calls me up and he's like, hey, we're under contract with Wild Blue. Here's our deadlines, which was
Wow.
funny because for the longest time, I thought writing a book just was that simple. Like you send an email with, a short synopsis and it's either a yay or nay. I thought it was this fast process. I didn't know that he had been spending months and months prior working on this project, and he was just trying to find a way to pitch it to me.
Well played.
Yes.
Slowly sucking him in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what? It worked out, right? Because I mean, once
Very much.
we started,
Mhm.
we were working on this night and day. A lot of times we would have a lot of late night conversations till 2 a.m. about what we had found. And so it was beneficial for me because it gave me a chance to really have something to focus on besides my family life. And so that was very therapeutic for me. And it was also, this was a good opportunity to do something with my brother, who at the time was living in a different state.
Nice. With the case, like there's obviously not a lot on it. So how did you find everything?
Go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, so a lot of times, like when I'm teaching a true crime class, I always tell students to start with the public records. And this was just because, and this is not like original to me. This was an advice that Mark Pinsky, someone who kind of was a kind of mentor early on to us, who's a really, really brilliant author in his own way. Cameron's had on his show. But, the public records, there's a lot of moving pieces in a complicated criminal investigation. And the one thing that won't change are the actual records. I mean, whether it's the medical examiner's report or search warrants, or if there was any kind of, if there was an arrest warrant or anything else like associated that you can actually get a hold of in the case, then, that's where we start and kind of build out from that. Both the public records associated with the case, but then also just starting with the actual victim and trying to find people who knew her. What was she like? What were her habits like? What were how did people who lived during this time respond to this crime? And so a lot of different things very early on like that. But I think one of the things that we ran into very early on was that a lot of the public records, to put this in perspective, so when I'm working on cases in classes with my students, a lot of times they file the records request, and usually within about 2 weeks, they can usually do most of it digitally because the FBI in the United States and many agencies are just completely online. So they file their request, and usually within 2 weeks in the semester, they get whatever records they're going to consider public and open delivered to them. In this case, when we were filing for public records, lots of things that would normally be available just weren't available, which was surprising to me because this might sound like an old case. And it is. It's 1973. It's over 50 years old. But I've had students work on cases from the early 1960s, and they got records pretty quickly. And we were constantly running into dead ends early on. And so that wasn't consistent with my own experience. And then it was also just complicated by the fact that when we were reaching out and talking to people associated with Virginia Olsen very early on too, it was just there was a lot of the people that we were talking to are in their 70s now as well. Many had passed away, many are older. So there was a lot of different things. But the public records are usually the starting place because people's names that are mentioned in those documents are other people you can research, which lead to other kinds of questions and other people. And
rabbit hole.
Yeah. And so it's like, a lot of the records that there's a lot of different separate stories we have just about the different issues that were with the records. One good example is the medical examiner's report. Just knowing exactly, because there have been all this conflicting information, like was she actually sexually assaulted? What kinds of forensics existed in the 1970s? That was a question I didn't know when we started that. What did they collect? Did they collect samples and things that would have been consistent with the 70s? Where are those samples? Like those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And requested the medical examiner's report. The North Carolina Medical Examiner's Office is really fantastic. They have a really good information system. You file requests, and I've gotten responses back from them within 24 hours. And so they are really good. And in this particular case, they said that they didn't have a copy of the record. And the reason they didn't have a copy of the record was the murder took place in 73, and there was a major fire that occurred in 1975 that destroyed all of their records.
Oh, no.
So they sent us to a place called North Carolina Archives, which was essentially a warehouse that they kept like older files in. And some of the charred remains of the original file were allegedly there, but we couldn't locate those. And so an issue early on was the fact that the police department and the state police, the State Bureau of Investigation, they were the agencies that did have the original copies. But because those had been placed in their master case file, they didn't consider it subject to a records request. And so they wanted to, or at least they said they wanted to early on, they couldn't share it with us for reasons, because they didn't want to get in the habit of just fulfilling records requests. That's not their job, right? In fairness. But yeah, so it was a long roundabout process. It's probably not super interesting, except that we had to
Actually,
Health and Human Services in the state, which basically oversees the medical examiner's office. And they basically said they got a copy of the medical examiner's report from the Asheville Police Department. And then they allowed me to file a records request for them. And then they sent me a copy of that report. So they basically served as an intermediary, and we're really good about that. And once we had the medical examiner's report, we learned that she died from a single stab wound. We learned that her throat was cut post-mortem. We learned that she had been sexually assaulted and that there had been semen collected at the time of the autopsy. And the sperm was still motile at the time. So those were like the kind of big findings that came about result of the actual autopsy, and the fact that the autopsy had occurred really fast. So her body was discovered at 3:30 p.m. on April 15th, 1973. And by 8:00 p.m. is when the medical examiner noted on the reports that we published in the book, the autopsy officially started. So like from the time the very first teenage boys discover her body, run out of the botanical garden screaming, people call the police, there's chaos. From that moment until the time her body had not only been transported out of the scene, but they were starting work on the autopsy. We are looking at 4.5 hours.
Yeah.
That's a quick turnaround time for an autopsy to happen on a victim. Was there something with the sperm sample that there was something about that, wasn't there?
Yeah, so there was this.
They lost that.
So DNA, they lost it, right? That's the short end of it. But the DNA didn't exist, of course. Like DNA acid didn't exist in the 1970s, and the medical examiner and others couldn't have anticipated. Typically, when semen samples were collected in the 1970s, it was used as one tool they could determine blood type, for instance, from semen samples. They could determine blood type. They could determine secretor status. And they had like other kinds of markers that they could use, but it was really just to slightly narrow the pool. The sperm sample was collected. It was looked at under a microscope. They saw the sperm were motile, so that was still fairly, it was recent, and they surmised that the semen was from a sexual assault that occurred during the actual murder. But outside of that, there was no other notation about the sperm sample. And that's something that's really going to come to haunt this case, because, by the time we get to the 1980s, a lot of this evidence doesn't exist anymore. And to this day, the Asheville police refuse to talk about the sperm sample directly. It's likely because they lost it. It's not a good look to say that it was discarded, even though it's not the fault of the investigators who were working on it originally, to expect that they would anticipate a technology that was really far away at that time. But the reality is that sperm sample does not exist. And I would love to be wrong on that, but it just doesn't. And so, yeah, that's kind of, so the forensics in this case is very complicated. They have clothes with a lot of blood on them. The medical examiner's report noted she lost roughly 3 liters worth of blood from a wound that was about like an inch in diameter. So there was a lot of blood. Her clothes were covered. They still have those. We fully believe that. And they say they have those clothes. So, but yeah, that's kind of all that exists.
Was it easy with Cameron being a cop to talk to the cops and try
That's a
get?
really good
That was the
question.
theory. Yeah, that was the
Yeah.
theory, at least early on. That was one of the many reasons I really wanted him on this. I thought this would eliminate some red tape for me.
So, true story. When Brian told me that, he needed help on this, I thought, okay, surely I know someone at Asheville or knows someone that knows someone at Asheville. So I started calling around, and like no one knew anyone from Asheville. It was like Asheville's on its own little island. And the really funny thing is, one of the agencies, I don't want to name its name, but that's near Asheville, when I called them about it and told them that me and my brother are writing a book, they're like, oh, you should check out so-and-so's case. We'll even bring you into the evidence room and you can take pictures. And, they were going to provide me everything. But I told them that, it was complete opposite with Asheville. I felt like that I was treated more like a just regular citizen. And I get it. I didn't know anyone personally there. But that was one of the frustrating things from my perspective, is that I'm used to, when we talk with, as a cop, if I call another agency and I'm asking them about a case or about a suspect, they'll tell me everything and they're not sugarcoating things. But even when we were having a conversation with the current cold case investigator, and we asked him if they still had the sperm sample, he said, we have DNA. And I was like, well, do you have DNA from sperm? And his response was, well, no, we've got DNA. And I was, okay, so
From where?
when we knew that they didn't have the semen sample, right? But that, and from my perspective, dealing with trying to obtain the search warrant, because that was another document that was vital in this case. It had never been made public. The suspect's name had never been made public, and I knew it was on the search warrant. And again, we asked the cold case detective if he could provide us the name on the search warrant. And he said that he couldn't do that. I asked him if I could get a copy of the search warrant. He said we had to go through clerk of courts, which is the standard procedure. You're supposed to go through the clerk of court where the search warrant is filed. And so I know you're probably not familiar with this, you basically have to go to the courthouse and there's a person that manages all the files. You fill out a simple form that you are requesting X, Y, and Z file, and you provide the information that like the person's name and date that it happened. You give it to them, and then it's a public document, so they have to give you a copy. They're not allowed to withhold it, except for in very special circumstances. This would not be one of them because of the age of the case. Well, the clerk of court couldn't find the search warrant. And to make a long story short, he told me to go around to a bunch of other places too. And eventually, because I would call every day, I'm not going to quit on this. And eventually he said, what do I have to get you to, or give you to, stop calling me? And I was like, well, you just have to, find someone that'll give me a copy of the search warrant. That's all I want. And he said, look, I'll be honest with you, buddy. I'm pretty sure that got destroyed. Back in 1990, they started to destroy files where people hadn't been charged, and they didn't upload electronic version. And so then I knew that the only copy was with the police department. And so I started contacting the city of Asheville and complaining. And then I sent the chief of police an email and told him as well, like, look, the clerk of court has lost this. They're telling me that's destroyed. I know that you have it, and this is a public document, so someone's going to have to share it with me. And after 4 months, they finally shared it. And that's when we were able to get the lead suspect's name.
Well, they say the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
I was going to say, were they happy when they heard you retired?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was a lot of greasing too. It wasn't just a few phone calls here or there. But and that was one of the things that, again, it was frustrating but kind of fun in the same way.
Yeah, bet.
Because I knew I was right. Like, I was like, I'm getting this. It's just a matter of time.
I will break them.
Right. I will break them. There's no quit.
I will never understand how when you research cases and it's like, oh, they destroyed the files even though it was not solved. It's like, surely get rid of the files.
Make an electronic.
Yeah, it takes 3 seconds to scan a document. Like,
and that blows me away too, right? When I first started to become a police officer in Raleigh, you had this program called a pre-hire program. So before the actual academy started, they would hire you, pay you full pay, full benefits, and they would just find odd jobs, just kind of like keep you around more or less, where you'd stay out of trouble. So they had this old building in downtown Raleigh where they kept old police files, and they would give us like 5 pieces of paper, and there's like 10 of us. And that would be our entire job for the day, would be to file those 5 pieces of paper and like stay out of everyone's way. So we would do that, and that would take, 5 to 10 minutes. And then we would start reading through some of these old files. But yeah, I mean, they kept everything. So I don't see why other departments would destroy those type of things.
Yeah,
and that became an issue. That became an issue with this, it like in a larger scale too, because it wasn't just as simple as, well, we've got the search warrant, we finally know this individual's name. And to put this in perspective, by the way, 1970 standards with press are vastly different than they are today. Today, we have things like protections against, for people who are victims of crime, especially, or people who are underage. Their names are typically not printed, and they'll withhold that if they're involved in a criminal investigation in any kind of way as witnesses or even as a perpetrator if they're underage. And in this case, for instance, the 2 boys who found Virginia Olsen's body on April 15th, they printed their names, their ages, their address, where they went to school. I mean, they gave they give us a lot of identifying information, and pretty much other people who were even at the scene, who were being interviewed by police, their names were popping up. Pretty much everyone's name and all of their contact information was being published. The only person's name that was withheld, which was the strangest part of all, because they didn't have any problem printing very sensitive information, was the main suspect. And that was weird, because there were other suspects throughout this process that they had no problem publicly naming, and why their main suspect and the only person where a search warrant was executed was never named. And that's a public document. And the press was very much aware of the actual search that happened because they wrote articles about it, but they could have named them, but they didn't. And so that was really of real interest to us. And that once we actually had the name, though, you're still left with the fact that, okay, great. So the principal suspect in this case was a man named John Rivas Jr., who lived about 1.8 miles from the crime scene. But it became, well, who the hell is John Rivas Jr.? Like, who are all these other names that are on this document? And so it really opens up more questions than anything else. And so with documents being destroyed, when we were researching John Rivas Jr., there was a lot of documents destroyed around him as well. He was a veteran of the Korean War, amongst other things. And he happened to be, his military records happened to be destroyed because I placed a records request with U.S. military. They were part of a massive fire that destroyed a lot of American military personnel's records. And this actually created real chaos in the 1960s and 70s for veterans benefits in this country. But his records were among the ones destroyed. He also had a previous arrest record, which I saw referenced in an article from an arrest in California. And when I requested those documents from the San Francisco Police Department, I was informed that they could tell me the date he was arrested and what the charge was, but the original record, they said, had been destroyed because of their retention schedule. So even when we knew there were particular records attached to him, many of those records, just because of the age and individual agency retention records, have been destroyed. So that's a really big challenge when you're a researcher looking at these.
Yeah, exactly. It's unreal.
So this John, is this the guy that said he said to a friend, he pointed her out, or I can't exactly remember.
That was James Gore.
Yeah, so that was a creep named James Gore, who was a religious leader in Black Mountain, which is just is a town close to Asheville. He had a religious he led a religious spiritual center called the Light Center that Cameron could probably tell you a little bit about. And but yeah, he's complicated because he is a name that is in the search warrant, but for all intensive purposes, he likely bears some criminal culpability for what happened as well. And his whole statement in the search warrant that you referenced was, yeah, he was present in the day with the police was main suspect, and he pointed out the girl. That's essentially what it says. Anyone listening can go read the actual document because we publish it in the book, but that's the gist of what his statement was. And one of the questions we had early on was, what the hell does that mean? Did he point out this girl because she was familiar to him and they knew her? If so, how did they know her? Was he pointing her out there for what reason? What does that even mean? We're assuming it was Virginia Olsen he was pointing out, because otherwise, why would you use that as one of your 5 kind of affidavits that you're including in the public search warrant justification? But what is that relationship to John Rivas that he had? What is their relationship to Virginia Olsen? These are all kinds of questions that were popping up.
To add on to that, Charles Chambers is the one that wrote the search warrant. He was a North Carolina State Bureau of Investigative special agent, and he had done a lot of murders and was actually a very good investigator. So when I was reading the search warrant, I put a lot of weight behind what he said. And one of the things that he picked up on was where James Gore is saying that he's standing, there's no way that he would have been able to see Virginia Olsen. And so that really brings me to the question, okay, well, why are you lying about where you're standing? Mm-hmm. Because if you're in essentially the woods where, she was murdered, he would have had to have actually moved down to that trail to actually be able to see her. And so I think that he was trying to not place himself directly at the scene, but knew that he was at the scene.
And he didn't come forward out of the goodness of his heart to offer testimony about this person. Essentially what happened was numerous witnesses noted, because he was a religious figure noted in the area, people had a sense of who he was. He was spotted in the area that day. And when police went to talk to him about what he was doing in the area, that's when he admitted, is my understanding of this, that he was there and with this John Rivas Jr. guy, and that he pointed her out. But as Cameron just mentioned, so he's kind of he's admitting that he was there, but he also tries to kind of deflect any suggestion that he's involved by saying, well, I'm basically across the street. There's a street called Weaver Boulevard that goes through the area adjacent to the botanical gardens. He said, I pointed her out from the street where we were standing. And the FBI agent, Charlie Chambers, he knows he's lying at that point, because as Cameron said, the spot where Virginia Olsen was not visible from the main road. But by his own admission, he pointed her out to John Rivas. So we know now we don't know why he's lying, but we know he's lying. And we also know that he's probably within 30 to 50 yards of Virginia Olsen in order to be able to see her. So he's placed himself now, based on some of the witness statements, within about 30 minutes of the crime taking place. And he's placed himself and John Rivas at around the crime scene, I think in Agent Chambers' mind.
The other thing, too, to keep in mind is these the suspects are not college-age kids. Virginia is 19 years old, and these guys are in their 40s. And, James Gore, he's the type that if you pull up his videos, you can find him on YouTube, and you'll see him do things like it reminds me of the TV evangelists that would like knock people out with their touch. I don't know if you've seen those where it's like,
Yeah.
they can be gone, and they touch him on the head. The guy collapses.
Yeah. You can walk again. Yeah.
Right. It's theatrics like that, right? Like I saw a video where he brought this guy up and he was like, I'm going to show you the power of the light. And he said, stick your arm out. And the guy sticks his arm out and he goes, now I want you to look at that woman and say, I see a woman. And he says, I see a woman. And he pulls his arm down really easy. And then he said, okay, now I want you to stare straight ahead and say, I am the light. And the guy goes, I am the light. And he like acts like he can't move his arm. He's like, see, it works.
Oh my God.
And it gets better. Did you know if you tell your car that your car is the light, you'll get 10 to 15 more miles per gallon.
Wow.
Wow.
So y'all
I'll try
need to
that
start
on the
doing
way
that.
to work.
Yeah. And all you have to do is look at your car and say, the car is the light. And you'll save gas. And according to him, there's quote studies on this.
He studies? That
Yeah,
he's done himself?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, he's an interesting guy, too, because he ends up becoming one of President Ronald Reagan's spiritual advisors. So it's a very interesting tie to that. Not his only one or even his main one, but he does travel with him by, reporting that was done in the Citizen Times. He does travel with Reagan to a nuclear arms summit in 1980. So we had some very interesting, colorful characters who were popping up on the search warrant. And that was one of the things that Cameron stressed very early on in this was that James Gore was someone that we should really be looking at. A lot of energy was placed, at least I was placing a lot of energy on John Rivas early on, but it's very easy to overlook the fact that James Gore has essentially made himself an accessory to murder just based on even the vague language that's used in the search warrant.
Yeah.
Actually, I've got to take credit for that too, because I said
we go.
that James Gore was just as morally responsible in the very first podcast that we did with Nick Edwards. And, I can now say that I was right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So James Gore's there, and James Gore's never been publicly talked about in this case either. I mean, I've placed a lot of weight on John Rivas, but James Gore's name is also in this warrant too, and he's never been publicly mentioned in connection with this case. When in fact he's one of only 4 individuals who's even mentioned tied to it in terms of the search warrant as having something to contribute. So,
and I'm going to interject in that too, because if you read some forums and some of the few Facebook groups that are out there that talk about this murder, that's one of the theories that was always out there, was that 2 people were present. Because you've got to keep in mind, if we want to, we can actually walk through the day of the murder, if that would be easier. But you've got, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. You've got her leaving her dorm. We know that she met some friends in the parking lot. We knew that she was studying for a Spanish exam, and she wanted to go to the Arboretum to study. And so she goes, and it's crowded that day. So she decides to go to the spot that's close to there, that's in the woods on like this rock, right? And she's sitting there, and we know that she's got her books there. And a few witnesses actually see her on that rock. And then when one of the witnesses comes back, he sees that there's no one sitting, or sorry, he saw at one point, he saw her sitting with a person. And then when he came back, her book was just there, and the pages were like flapping in the wind. And she was no longer there. And then eventually that afternoon is when the 2 high school kids found her body after leaving a weenie roast. All right. But this is happening in the middle of the daytime.
Yeah.
And this is so populated that she has to actually leave, or does not even want to be in like the arboretum garden area to go to this other spot. But we know that the kids are having a weenie roast. We know that there's hikers hiking around. So it's probably not the place that you want to rape and murder someone if you're a predator, unless you're sure that no one's going to see her or, hear the person, right? And so that was a big question that I had originally when I was, looking at this, was how did this happen in the middle of the daytime? And I'd always assumed, which we actually confirmed with the cold case detective, like, did it really happen on kind of this rock, or did it happen off the rock? And we later learned that it happened, I believe, like 10 feet away from the rock. So the suspect either coached her off that rock or, forced her off that rock. And that's where she was raped and murdered. But we also know from the autopsy, what we can gather is that at some point her pants were pulled around her ankles, as well as we don't know if her underwear was removed or she didn't have any underwear, but that was not listed on there.
Right.
But we do know that the suspect used a knife to cut her shirt and to make essentially bindings for her legs, wrist, and then to gag her with. And then we know that she had scuff, like abrasions on her knees. So I don't know if that was part of the sexual assault, or if that was maybe she was forced to crawl or she tried to get away. But we do know that at some point she was stabbed in the heart. And then after that, when her heart had stopped, is when her neck was sliced. And we know that because there wasn't any blood coming out of her neck. So that's why we know that her heart had stopped. And then we know that the police arrive. We know that the scene was not locked down properly. And what I mean by that is this is not something where crime scene tape is put up and everyone is pushed out of that perimeter and you've got a sterile scene where you can actually process that scene appropriately, like what should have happened, right? That, and there should have been a canvas for witnesses. We know that that didn't happen because we've seen photos of people milling around, and it was actually Virginia's roommate who was able to walk to the scene with a picture and show it to a police officer, and that's how they confirmed who it was. God. So you've got all this happening, right? And then we also know that not a lot of pictures were taken. One of the reasons for that is film was so expensive. You've also got police department that in 1973 did not have a lot of training because North Carolina training and standards had just happened. And that is the department that actually mandates what police officers learn and are required to learn. So things like crime scene management was not taught. If it was informally taught, or you had to go to another outside agency. But we know that Asheville as a whole is a very safe and relatively quiet place. So these guys are not getting a lot of experience with murders. And then what we also mentioned too about how the body was quickly taken away, because we know that the autopsy happened, I believe, 5 hours after the
4.5, yeah.
4.5 hours, okay, after the body was discovered. So that means that there was not a lot of time spent processing the body at the scene. and I know that I'm not trying to be critical of the officers, because we can't apply 2025 standards to 1973 standards. But when we look at this case of why it's not solved in 2025, that is a really big part of it, is that things were not handled correctly. Things were not processed and collected correctly. And I think that's what probably led to the semen sample being destroyed or lost.
And so all the subsequent investigations after this original one, this original investigation, if we think about the original investigation as being really the first year of the investigation, the subsequent investigations, there's going to be two more really big pushes in this case. Those officers are really kind of starting at a disadvantage. They're starting without significant evidence, or they're starting without sufficient evidence and really having to kind of start over. But there's a lot of different complications, not only in terms of just the forensics in this case, but also just things like, by that point, the main suspect, this search warrant was served exactly 14 days after Virginia Olsen's murder, April 29th, 1973. By the time we get out of this first year of the investigation, not only is a lot of this evidence going to be lost, but the principal suspect is going to bounce out of town and go to Boston, Massachusetts, and he's going to remain there for a number of years, and is really going to be protected by his family and not really subject to he's not putting himself in a position to do police interviews or anything else. That gets shut down really quickly. And so they're not really left with a lot of places to go. Now, they do a really fascinating investigation in being thorough and trying to consider other possibilities. They go to 4 other different states to track down different leads, and they're following everything they can, while this other main suspect, who they continuously kind of come back to, is basically non-cooperative. And they're running into roadblocks with him. So they're trying to explore other possibilities too, because there wasn't slam dunk evidence at the time specifically against him during that early part of the investigation.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, she's just taking it all in. And there was also, you mentioned a serial killer possibly linked to it.
So that was when I was looking at this, and especially after we talked with the cold case detective, he said that he did not believe that the person in the warrant was responsible. And I said, okay, well, if it's not him, then, this seems to be a very brazen crime for someone that's never murdered someone.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you bound and raped someone. Oh, it's fine. You bound and raped and killed someone in the middle of the daytime. And so
with 100 people around.
What's that?
With 100 people around. There's roughly 100 people around.
Yeah. Very
so
confident.
I started to look at, okay, what other cases are there that are similar to that around that time frame? And that's why I found the Sue Ellen Evans case that happened at North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which is about 3 hours east of Asheville. And that was a similar case where she was a student at school. She's walking in the middle of the daytime through their arboretum, and an unknown person snatches her into the bushes and tries to rape her and is unsuccessful. She's starting to fight. And so he stabs her in the heart, just like Virginia, and then slices her neck, just like Virginia. And so I found that really odd that they were so similar. And so then I started to research, okay, well, what serial killers were around that time that had a similar MO? And that's when I was led to Terry Hyatt. And then after I started digging into Terry Hyatt, I found out that, well, he actually grew up in Asheville and was 16 at the time of Virginia's murder. And the first victim that he had, guess what day that happened on?
Oh, Jesus.
April 15th. just a different year.
Oh.
And guess how he killed people? The same way. He would ambush them. He would actually use another person as an accomplice, and he would rape them, stab them in the chest, and then slit their throat. And we know that he's responsible for at least 3 murders, and they all happen the same way. So it just seemed so coincidental that we would have a serial killer in the area. He's 16. He's already doing some petty offenses. He had been stealing some cars, robbing women of their purses. We know that he had already dropped out of school. That was the other thing. So, okay, we know that he wouldn't have been in class during that time because he's not even in school. And we know those high school kids were having a weenie roast. So I don't think it would be a far-fetched to say, well, maybe he was going to try to hang out with that crowd. And yeah, I think that when you look at that type of person, that's who I would imagine did a crime like this.
Is he still alive?
He's on death row right now. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. He's in Central Prison in North Carolina.
Has anyone ever asked him about this?
What's that?
I said, has anyone ever asked him about this story, this case?
So I didn't want to start out with that. So I tried to ask him about his hobbies and
so what do you like to
especially because I had to tell my wife about this in case he did respond and she got the mail. And so I told her, I said, hey, by the way, I'm going to have to write this guy named Terry. He's a serial killer and I don't think he's going to respond. But she was like, well, do you have to give your address? It's got 3
boxes of 4.
Yeah. We'll be okay.
He's in jail.
But yeah, he didn't respond. But the letter was more or less trying to get him to. I told him I was like a friend of a friend and asked him just like about like sports and what did he do with his time. I didn't want to ask him at first, how many people did you really kill? Or did you kill Virginia Olsen? I was going to save that for later. But yeah, he's definitely one that I'm certain killed more than 3 people. And I say that because the only reason, and we talked about this in the book, the only reason why he even got caught was because his drunk friend went into the sheriff's department, drunk off his ass, talking about how he wanted to get something off his chest and started to tell the investigator about this murder they witnessed where Terry grabbed this girl and, raped and killed her. And then he said, if you don't believe me, he gave a name of a friend. And the investigator goes and talks to the friend, and the friend starts telling him about this completely different murder that he was with Terry.
Jeez.
And you'll have to read more about it in the book, but during that process, they put his DNA into CODIS after trial. And that's when he popped for another murder in Charlotte. And you can actually hear that interview it's on YouTube. And it's really fascinating just to see of how nonchalant he is about murdering someone. He said he was driving by and the girl had just gotten off work and he decided that he wanted to have sex with her. So I remember he said that I snatched her up before she even knew it. And he had a knife to her throat. And he said that he raped her. And then after he raped her, he knew that he could not let her go. And so he stabbed her in the heart and slit her throat.
If you're looking at someone like Terry Hyatt, the other thing is if you want to play this game where you play the kind of magical what if, the other thing interesting about this is that the area where the murder occurred was one known as by law enforcement at the time and by people who lived in the area is a spot frequented by either both winos, but also a kind of lover's lane for like high school students, which is why those high school students weren't too far off. It's close to the botanical gardens, but it's just a little bit more privacy and slightly more secluded. And so if you think about, one of Terry Hyatt's victims is going to be, their body's going to be left not too far from the actual botanical gardens. I think it's within 3 miles. And so you think about, there's that, plus the fact he was 16 years old at the time. He certainly, it was very likely that he would have been aware that this was a spot frequented by his peers. And so, there's that. So I think if you were looking at ways to consider Terry, and the current cold case detective did confirm that Terry Hyatt had been looked at. I believe that's correct, right, Cameron? He didn't tell us. It was very vague, and it was hard to tell if he was actually telling the truth or not. It could have.
I'll be honest with you. I don't think that he's had a conversation with him.
Yeah. So
I say that because, sorry to interrupt you, but there was more than a few people that supposedly he had talked with and he hadn't. And one of them was Virginia's boyfriend, who was the last person to see her before she went back to Asheville. And I told Brian this, and I want to be clear, he is not responsible. He's been very helpful. But the fact that if you look at it statistically, it is going to be, a boyfriend or a spouse in these murders. Especially stranger rape is extremely rare in the US. Usually, your attacker. The fact that this happened in the middle of the daytime, I bet that if you calculated that into, it would make it astronomical. And them not talking with him at all.
Yeah.
And he even emailed us and told us that he thought it was really weird that he's never been contacted by any law enforcement. And so when I heard that, I thought, okay, you're in your 70s. Maybe you forgot. So I emailed Asheville and I said, is there any way that you can send me a piece of the report that is completely redacted except for Jeff's name, just so then I can confirm that you talked to him at some point? And of course, no response.
And there's other pieces of evidence like that too. So another thing is that that they never reviewed was Virginia Olsen was a prolific letter writer. And so she was still in the process of establishing a friend group in Asheville. She died during the second semester of her sophomore year. So she was just finishing her second year. And so she was both very shy, but also very kind of, she was a shy person by nature who had developed close relationships with people in Virginia, where she had lived before she moved to North Carolina for college, but was still in the process of establishing a friend group there. And so she kept in close touch with her friends in Virginia. And one of the things we talk about in the book was some of these reactions from her friends, because she would write, in some cases, weekly. She would go through periods where she'd write letters to them on a weekly basis. The very last letters that she wrote were postmarked April 14th, 1973, 24 hours before she was murdered. And so one of the things that more than one of her friends had described to me was just this very strange sensation. And we quote Jeff Doyle is in the book directly talking about this as well. This very strange experience of going to her funeral, which was a very horrible affair in its own kind of way. It was a big storm came up. They were struggling with the casket. The music was off. It was a very, very sad kind of affair. But they describe coming back home to their homes from this funeral and receiving letters that had been written the day before. And so because a lot of these letters, and some of these other letters were described to me, was just telling them about what she was doing, or what, things that she was doing on campus, or kind of what she was thinking, all of those types of things. Those would be things that go to victimology, right? And those were letters that more than one individual who'd received letters written 24 hours before she died, those letters have unequivocally never been looked at by the police. And in fact, we've tried to make them aware at different points. Cameron had sent a text message to one of the detectives at one point, like, hey, if you're interested in these letters, we're happy to put you in touch because we think there could be something potentially useful in this you might want to look at. Just no response. There was no response whatsoever to that message. And so there's very little interest on their part. And at least my working theory is they know exactly who is responsible for this. And it is likely John Rivas and James Gore. And that because there were so many mishaps in this case, because both of these individuals are dead, because kind of telling the entire story would potentially really just embarrass
them.
department, I think, in lots of different ways. Like, at least I don't feel like they should be embarrassed, but that's what more than one individual have told me is probably likely the kind of reason in these types of cases where there's after so much time has passed, where there's that like real lack of transparency, even about just basic details of it. And so, yeah, I think that the investigation itself, they'll tell you it's open and active, but even when kind of new evidence is brought to their attention, and we uncovered some more evidence as well in this, these leads have never been followed up. And I know because I'm still in touch with the people who were these leads originated from, and they tell me that's any contact. So I can say that is for sure.
Wow. So since obviously the book came out at the start of this year, 2025, have you found out anything? Have people contacted you from, hey, I read the book, my grandpa was there?
Well, there's been some things bigger and some things smaller. So we have a few really big leads that if you're interested in this book and case, just stay tuned, because within the next 6 months, we're going to have some really big news to share surrounding this case. In terms of some of the smaller leads that came up, so one of the things we quoted in the book, and something that has long been quoted, was in her notebook that was found at the actual crime scene, there was a poem that has always been attributed to Virginia Olsen. And we quote that poem in the book. In fact, the original media coverage in the 1970s attributed to Virginia Olsen. The yearbook that came out for UNC Asheville in 1973 also included that poem and attributed it to her. And so we felt quite confident attributing it to her as well, since everyone else has for the past 50 years. When we appeared on Nick Edwards' podcast, Nick Edwards of kind of True Crime Garage fame, we were on a new podcast that he started called True Crime Talk, and as his first guest. And after that show aired, he passed along an email from a listener who said, that poem was a poem that was popular in the 1970s in Alcoholics Anonymous circles that was circulating materials. And so that was like a small thing that was like a new thing, because for years that's always just been attributed to Virginia Olsen. We knew that wasn't hers. And there were some other things that we learned that came about surrounding John Rivas through subsequent research and other people. We have other images of John Rivas and other things that we were not able to get the rights to include in the book, but we've discovered other materials. But we also think that we found the last piece of evidence to definitively connect John Rivas to this case and finally kind of bring this one to a close. And so that's the kind of goal, I think, for the next year, is to continue to not just force the public conversation about this, but to also encourage the district attorney and others that will be involved to really kind of give some public accounting for this and just with it after 50 years.
Exactly.
Fingers a lot crossed. Of responses that we've gotten is I'll have people reach out to me and say, oh, this person worked on the case. I'll put you in touch with them. And then they'll call me back the next day and said, sorry, you're dead. Or they're in assisted living, and they've got Alzheimer's. It's a lot of, and that's the really hard part about this case is we're fighting time. And we finally found someone that we believe is going to be able to hopefully go on the record and put some closure to all this. But it's been a really hard process to be able to do that.
I hope you're recording every conversation you have with them and take their path.
There were some people who had potentially important information that just didn't feel comfortable sharing it, and that's fine.
Mm.
There were other individuals, like Cameron said, who were just deceased. All of the original witnesses who are on the search warrant affidavit, all of them are dead now. This is Judy Beadle, this is Ray Honeycutt, this is Gerald Eccles. All of these individuals are no longer here. And so all of the original investigators, except for 3, I believe, are all deceased now. And so and so yeah, so there was it's a very, and then with the records that were lost, it is a lot of research. It's a lot of very complicated kind of research, maneuvering and triangulating information to kind of put, in some cases, basic facts together. And one of the goals of this book was really just because no one really kind of just knew what happened, to put together that this is what happened. This was who was involved in the investigation. And by the way, the State Bureau of Investigation, who are really fantastic and have been really helpful in some ways, I will say that they didn't even have a record of their own agents who worked this case. When I reached out to the public information officer, Angie Grube, if she is listening, she is really fantastic, by the way. But Angie Grube, like I said, like, well, let me get some of my staff on this to look, because I don't see any records that these agents' names, the files were probably destroyed. Said, like, what? Like, I can tell you they worked on the case, but I passed along the actual newspaper article. Like, it says FBI agent James Thomas Maxey, do you have any personnel records confirming that he worked there? And the original answer was no. It's like, then who is this person? And then, and they eventually did track down and gave me dates of his employment. So I was able to get some very rudimentary kind of basic information, but I think that points to just the difficulty in confirming basic facts. And after we corralled all this stuff together, some of it is just about preserving, this was who was involved in the investigation. This is what we can piece together actually happened. This is when the investigation derailed and why you haven't heard about it. This is why we think it derailed. And this is what it means. And these are some ways that we think this could actually be solved. So, and we republish all of the original documents in the book as well. And so that we were able to get copies of. So for any of your listeners who are out there who read these and you see something that maybe we are missing, or a question that maybe you feel like we don't address in the book, reach out to us. Like, we are interested in everyone talking about this case, because we think at this point in time, it's the only way we can actually force a conversation with the Asheville police.
Yeah, definitely.
Amazing.
I think that's why true crime podcasts exist, is to retell stories and get them back out there, especially unsolved ones. Like, as you said, a person might look at it with a different mindset and go, oh, well, actually, I think this, or have you thought of this? And yeah, if 100 people look at it different ways, hopefully something comes out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a really good way to make sure that her name kind of stays out there and stays alive. For the longest time, this was not a household name, and we've tried our best to put this in front of as many people as possible. That way people do know about her and know about her life and know about how tragically it was taken away. And hopefully we will, that will lead to people being held responsible and publicly named.
Yeah, hopefully.
And something that's been, like, really, I think, gratifying with this whole thing, which I mentioned to you off air before, was just that this case, occurred on the first day of the Watergate hearings in the United States. So Richard Nixon's the impeachment proceedings were about to, the hearings that would lead to ultimately, like, the impeachment charges that were going to move forward before he resigned. That occurred on the same day that she was murdered as well, that same week. And so it never really gets national attention. We think in many other circumstances it will get national attention. So it never gets out of North Carolina, really. And so and the coverage really drops off after 1974. And having audiences from not only, like, around the United States, but other countries outside of this, just being able to tell the stories, it sends chills up my spine every time I hear people say Virginia Olsen, because this person who has been largely forgotten, even by the community, that she belonged to at UNC Asheville. To this day, like the fact that people just know who she was or this thing happened to her is a really big deal. I think it reminds me of the power of podcasts and the kind of work that this can be done to just kind of speak and lay claim to some of these things actually happening, and that these things actually have impacted people's lives. And the people who knew and loved Virginia Olsen have been forever impacted by this, and have had the privilege of interacting with some of them. And it's and so being able to make other people aware of it is a really kind of big part of this as well.
Because she turned into sort of a ghost story, didn't she, at the university?
She did. I mean, and this is, I was, like a lot of theater programs, like in fairness, like they have like ghosts around their theaters. Like there's like ghost stories are not like uncommon in theater to begin with, but it's just really unfortunate in this case because this is the only murder to happen in the school's 97-year history. And so by transforming her into a ghost story, aside from just the obvious like disrespect that's like inherent in that, what it also did was it distanced people from the person of Virginia Olsen, and it also, I think, discourages us from thinking about this as an actual crime that's unsolved. Like, yeah, this sounds like a fun ghost story, but the kind of presence of this kind of still hangs over the campus in different ways, and it's something they have a hard time discussing. And I think a ghost story is a lot easier to discuss. That sounds fun than dealing with the reality that one of your students was raped and murdered. On this.
All right. Well, Meg and Mom, do you have anything more for us, or do you want to wrap this up?
No, I think do you have any?
No, I'm in.
She's
Yeah,
soaking it all in.
All right.
This isn't my thing. That's
well, you're our target audience. You're our target audience then too with this.
Yeah,
like
100%.
We didn't write this book just for just true crime aficionados. Like this is something that we're hoping is just for something for everyone. And for those people that are true crime aficionados, though, we do have a lot of other stories that we didn't touch on tonight. There was one of the many complications in this case was there are a series of different crimes that take place around the anniversary of Virginia Olsen's murder. And for a number of years, these really confused authorities trying to discover if there is a potential connection between them. So it's the story itself has lots of different layers. And so if you do like that mystery with lots of twists, you'll find that here. But outside of that, we do hope this is a human interest story as well for those
100%.
not necessarily just hardcore true crime fans who just want to know about this kind of case that has had a big impact, and people should kind of care about this case, I think.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. So the book is A Murder on Campus, The Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case. You can buy the book on Amazon, Kindle, Audible, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, pretty much anywhere where you can get a book. So please go check that out. Also, if you want to support Mainly Murder with Meg and Mom, please like and subscribe. They are on Apple, Spotify, and also YouTube. And ladies, where can we find you on social media?
Mainly_murder. Very simple.
All right. And while we're supporting people, let's make sure we support Brian Santana as well. You can go to his new website, www.briansantanaauthor.com. I believe he's got some articles on there about some other cases that he's working on. If you would like to support me, please like and subscribe to Santana True Crime. You can also follow me on Santana True Crime on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts, as well as you can find me on social media at Santana True Crime on IG, Twitter, TikTok. I believe I'm on most social media. It's all Santana True Crime. So we're keeping that easy. Ladies, thank you very much. And Brian, thank you as well. Good night.
Night.
Bye.